Hello guys, this is Mr. Gibson. Just looking at this Theology 1 final exam review. Looking at the short answer portion. Number 1, know the being Christian quote. So you're going to either have this question or the next one, where you're going to have to, for the first one, you'll have to just rewrite the quote from memory or the main ideas in it. You don't have to write it word for word, but every idea from it. So the quote is actually, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, the encounter with an event, a person which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. For the exam review, you just literally write that. For the test, you can literally write that, or you could write something like, being a Christian, it happens not because you're a good person or you have a great idea, but you encounter Jesus and what he's done for you, and that changes you forever and gives you a new life. Like this kind of, if you said all that, or something similar, you would get all the points as well. 2, what are the synoptic gospels in general? So I want a definition of synoptic. Syn, S-Y-N, it comes from the Greek word with, and optic has to do with the word seen. So these are the gospels that are seen together, or in other words, the gospels that have many characteristics and probably sources in common. So you could say they're the gospels that have a lot of common a lot of wording and sources in common. And the gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I'll either do number 1 or 2. Then number 3, do the Gospels contradict each other in a Catholic understanding? The short answer is no, but that doesn't mean we're legalists and the Bible, the passages have to be word for word the same in the 4 Gospels, because they're not. It's a fact. And so I'll give you an example, and I need you to look at this. Matthew 16, Mark 8, Luke 9. There's even one in John, sort of. And I want you to see, okay, in Matthew, Peter calls Jesus what? And I want you to look this up and remember it. And in Mark, he says something, and in Luke, he says something. And I want you to say something about that. Like Peter calls Jesus the Christ in this gospel. It's when he says he's the Christ of God, and this one he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. It appears that these gospels are contradicting. That would only be the case, though, right? If the Bible passages have to be, when we say that they don't contradict, that they're literally have to record word for word what happened. We believe that they express the same truth, but from a different angle, sort of like a car wreck. You might have someone on one side of the road who emphasizes one point, another person emphasizes another. The driver might emphasize something different from the person who was hit, the driver who was hit versus the driver who hit the other one. You're going to have different perspectives. This nevertheless could be true. And remember, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are written to specific communities for specific purposes, so they're going to emphasize things that help send a message to relate to the community to which they're writing. And so we want to protect and this is with the Mark Strauss paper, you want to remember the vertical and the horizontal reading of the Gospels, that you want to have both. You don't want to just read them without thinking about the other ones. The contrast helps you see their message, but also take them for themselves in their own word. And see that, hey, they're saying the same thing, but maybe with a different emphasis on the different syllable. All right, and then number 4 and 5, you have these two bigger ones. I mean, they're just not that long, but number 4, explain the gospel from a Catholic perspective. This one is so broad, you could do a lot of things, but I kind of give you a guideline on what I want. It says, like, begin with creation, discuss the fall of the spiritual spiral sin and its effects. So this is basically the book of Genesis. It's kind of recalling what we did last semester, and the kind of stuff we're doing at the end here with Romans is that God made the world good for the purpose of to reflect his glory, and that man would bring it back to him as a priest. But man rejected God, killed the life within him, and then not only did he sin, but the effects of his sin sort of spread to all levels of society and his relationships, and ultimately brings death. But right after the fall, in the midst of that spiral of sin, in Genesis 3, God promises that he's going to fix the problem of sin and restore man's relationship with him, and that's implied in what's called the Proto-Evangelium in Genesis 3:15, where God tells the snake that he curses him, and then says God that the woman will give birth to a seed, and that seed will crush the serpent's head, and he'll strike his heel. And so we see God begin to follow through, be righteously with his word, and accomplish what he said, be faithful to his word through a man named Abram. He calls Abraham out of all these pagans, and makes promises and covenants with him that he's going to restore the world, fix the problems through him and his descendants. Abraham, miraculously has a son, and that seed, that his descendants continue all the way to remember it goes Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob has 12 sons, and then of those 12 sons we get the 12 tribes of Israel, and from those 12 tribes we get the nation of Israel eventually through the Exodus, and then from one of those tribes, Judah, we get a king who's God makes a covenant with the line of David that it's going to last forever, and that God's going to rule the world through this descendant of David, who eventually is tied to be the Messiah, this one anointed or set apart. That's what Messiah means, to fix the problem of sin. Then there's this mysterious figure of the suffering servant in the book of Isaiah, that this same person who's like Messiah is going to defeat Israel's enemies and do all this awesome stuff. Is going to suffer as a victim for sin, that he's going to take on his people's sins, represent them before God, and fix that problem, because God isn't trying to just give Israel the physical blessing of the land and lots of physical descendants, but he wants something greater, and he's going to accomplish this through what's called the suffering servant. And so we get a bunch of prophets who speak of the coming of a Messiah who's going to fix everything, what God said in Genesis, and crush the serpent's head and restore a right relationship with God. And it doesn't seem to happen. Even Israel, remember, goes into exile. The northern tribes first, then the southern and the Babylonian exile. And then the temple's destroyed. We get a return under the Persians, thanks to Ezra, Nehemiah, and then Zerubbabel, and then some other people in the books of some of the prophets. You'll see that in Ezra, Nehemiah, those books. But things kind of stink. Like, even though God's has brought the people back to the land, a group of them, the Jews, the Judahites, it doesn't seem like God's fulfilled his promise. It seems like God hasn't followed through, because the temple is in ruins, and even when they rebuild it, it looks kind of like horrible and not as awesome as the one Solomon built. And so the people are still hoping for something greater. And even in the end, the Romans eventually take over the land, and then it just seems like Israel's in the same position as it was. Herod built this awesome temple, but he's kind of like a poser, and so Israel's not happy. They don't like the fact that they're occupied. God hasn't fulfilled his promises. But Jesus comes on the scene, claims to be the one to fix these problems, but a lot of people couldn't see that he was the snake crusher, because he died on a cross, and that just didn't fit a lot of people's paradigms about what God should do. But what Jesus was doing is he was representing, like the suffering servant in Isaiah, the people of Israel, and taking all the sins and consequences of sin into himself justly, and representing humanity on the cross is a sort of being a head, as a man, but also as the king, a head of Israel, a descendant of David, a king, doing what Israel could never do, obey God and follow his love and will. And he merited, because he was so righteous, God's vindication and resurrection from the dead as a human. And because of the power of his resurrection, he overcame sin and all of its effects, and can share that overcoming if we just unite with him. So the more, and how do we unite with Jesus? By having faith in what he's done for us, and through baptism and through the sacraments. And so we unite and have a union with Jesus. And if we unite with Jesus, what we do is we join him in dying to sin and all of its consequences and its power over a man, and then letting his life live within us and raise us up to overcome sin and fill us with his spirit that raised him from the dead, so that we can live and love others as he has loved us. So you can see this, I'm summarizing basically my understanding of the gospel, but a lot of those thoughts come from a video that I have attached that I want y'all to watch, and you can get basically that story summed up in an even better way probably than what I did, in a quicker way there. But you need to get to the Jesus part. Don't just use meaning statements up until Jesus, but you need to kind of complete the story. The Romans 1-8 explanation is very similar, except you need to follow Romans. You need to kind of get a breakdown of each chapter of Romans. And so the book of Romans, and we're going to talk about this in class, it seems to be written to unify a divided church between those who are maybe Gentiles and Jews. And a lot of people debate, though, what it means. You don't need to write this part. But Paul is basically trying to write about what the gospel means, and he kind of makes a thesis statement in Romans 1:17 and 18, saying it's the power of God maybe 16 and 17. The power of God unto salvation for all who believe. It's the power of God and the righteousness of God. The main argument is that in Romans 1, as he's setting up, he's going to say, hey, the gospel's for everyone. It's powerful, and it shows God was faithful to his promises. And so how does he prove that? Well, the first part, Romans 1, so this is where you can start. Paul proves that all the Gentiles are screwed up, that they've all sinned. And he kind of shows that they're guilty because they could know that God exists by the natural law. What he says is like reason. Like if you look at the world, you can see that God exists. And man in his heart has his conscience, and yet he chooses not to follow it. And so even Gentiles are guilty of sin because God has made a way for humans to know what's right and wrong through their consciences and the law he's written inside of them. 2, he says, hey, maybe a Jew would get all excited, like, we're awesome, we're the solution, we've got the law, so we're better than the Gentiles. But then he shows how even though the Jews have the law, which is a good thing, they don't follow it. So it's almost worse because they know that they should do explicitly. God says don't do this, but then they do it anyway, or God says do this and they don't do it. So they have more responsibility because they're sort of kind of supposed to be like a big brother who teaches the world how to follow God's law, but they couldn't. They're hypocrites, and because oftentimes they'll accuse other people around them of not following the law, but they themselves don't follow it. Maybe they kind of see the outward stuff like, oh, he's an adulterer, but maybe in their hearts they're lusting. They have this hypocrisy. But there's good news. That's chapter 3. That's the third one. That even though all have sinned, both Jews and Gentiles, God's made a solution through Jesus, that Jesus represents humanity on the cross, and he takes in the consequence of sin. And that's what the word atonement means. He kind of covers sin, and through that he makes up for sin, but he also fulfills God's plan and makes us able to be righteous before him like Jesus is, because Jesus is always righteous. He never sins. He follows God's law. We don't as humans, but Jesus can take on our unrighteousness and share with us and give us a share in his righteousness. So Romans 4 says, well, then who is a part of God's family? Because it seems like in the Old Testament that the Gentiles aren't included. It's just the Jews. And so in Romans 4, Paul uses Abraham to show that Abraham's promise that he was made right with God by believing in God, not because of that God counted him righteous in Genesis 15 before even the laws were kind of given to Abraham. And then what law does he use to sort of represent the laws, all the commandments of the Torah? It's the circumcision. So he says that Abraham wasn't circumcised till several chapters later in his life. He was first made righteous by faith in God. And what was Abraham believing? That God was going to do what he promised. And what was he going to promise? That he's going to rescue the world and through Abraham's seed. And who is that fulfilled in? Jesus. So in a way, Paul implicitly, not knowingly, but in a conscious understanding that Jesus was whom he was believing in, believes in Jesus in a sort of foreshadowed way. And so Abraham's descendants are those who are like him, who will have faith in God's promises. That's how we're made righteous, part of God's covenant people. So in other words, Paul's arguing that a lot of Jews prided themselves as being Abraham's descendants according to their flesh, or that they are circumcised, that their descendants, their genetics, their genealogies are from Abraham. Paul's arguing that that's not what the Bible, even the Old Testament itself, is showing us how you're made righteous, are part of Abraham's family. You're made part of Abraham's family when you believe in what he believed and imitate him, and that's how you become a descendant of Abraham. Now, Jesus was a descendant of David and Abraham, and that's shown at the beginning of the book of Romans, but Paul's saying you can join that family if you have faith in Jesus and what he's done. And then Romans 5, he says, hey, well, how do you actually enter into it? What's that process look like, and how is this possible? Well, Romans 5, we see that Jesus is like a new Adam. The old Adam represents all of us. We're all born into the old Adam. We're born with what's called original sin. Something's shattered in our humanity when we come into this world. It's not that we are stained. It's more that we have a lacking of God's life within us. But and we all deserve to be a part of what Adam's. We're all a part of this pattern of sin and death that Adam left us, and so we kind of are stuck in this condemned state. But Jesus, as a human, became a sort of new beginning for humanity, and God made it as he sort of was, because he's God in the world. He sort of can represent humanity, do what Adam should have done. God in Jesus is representing all of us again. But this time, it's not a human person, but a divine person in a human nature doing what humans can never do on their own. And so Jesus acts does what Adam should have done. He obeys God and dies and becomes a new head of a new humanity. And how does he do that? Well, you enter into Jesus by faith and baptism. Paul says that you die to your old humanity, the Adam-like one, and you enter, and then you're Jesus, and you die into Jesus and what he did for you on the cross. And through that union, he gives you a share in his new humanity that God fills with the Spirit that makes you able to live like Jesus lived. And so 6, we see that we're called to live in this new humanity in a way that the Spirit of God is empowering us to love others as God has loved us. But the problem is in 7, we see, hey, well, doesn't that sort of mean that all the stuff in the Old Testament, all the laws God gave are a waste of time and bad? Because don't they seem to say that, aren't you saying that the law makes us sinful? And Paul says, heck no. The law is good. It shows us our sin, but it can't actually save you. The law doesn't have any power in it in itself, but it shows us what we need and how much we need God. And the good news, and this is Romans 8, is that God, through Jesus, doesn't just, he forgives us of the condemnation we deserve by not following the law, but more than that, he gives us a Spirit so we can actually obey the law. And so through the Holy Spirit, man's heart is changed, and he's able to, in spite of the battle within us, which he calls the flesh, that tendency in humanity to sin. It doesn't mean the body, but the flesh is sort of an expression. I don't know where a lot of people debate what it comes from. That's that part of humanity that's not turned toward God, that we sort of naturally have. It's not a sin in itself to have, but if we allow that part within us to kind of have reign over our life, then we become slaves to sin and experience death. But if we, in contrast, unite ourselves with Jesus, we experience the Holy Spirit, who only puts new desires in us to love God and others as he's loved us. And not only that, it gives us a foretaste of what heaven will be like when all of the world will be renewed. So you can watch use the notes from the Bible Project to fill out this in maybe a more succinct way. But anyway, good luck on the exam.